Hello and welcome to today's lesson. I'm your hard-working but indefatigable teacher, Mr. Burton. You will need to watch this video and take notes as you go. You may need to watch certain parts of the video a few times to ensure complete understanding. This is your homework and I will check your notes tomorrow before we get started. I hope you learned something.
Okay, welcome to today's lesson, and this lesson is on measuring the amount of economic activity that's taking place. We have a few ways of measuring economic activity, and the first is the expenditure approach. And this is based on the different types of expenditure that are occurring in the economy. So consumption spending, plus investment spending, plus government spending, plus net exports. And this equals GDP. And GDP is the total value of goods and services that an economy is producing in any given year. So GDP equals, for short, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And the advantage of us looking at the expenditure method is data integrity. Most countries consider the source data for expenditure components to be more reliable, more accurate than either income or output components. As such, this is what we will focus our attention on. Right, C. Private final consumption expenditure. You will need to identify this in national accounts. And this is household expenditure on the consumption of domestically produced goods and services. Investment. And the national accounts, investment is trickily named gross fixed capital formation. And this is expenditure by firms on domestically produced capital goods and services. Government spending. In the national accounts, this is identified as general government final consumption expenditure, and it's just government spending, so the purchase of goods and services, transfer payments, etc. Net exports. We're talking about the export of goods and services and the imports of goods and services. So that's it. Spending on goods, exported goods, minus spending on imported goods and services, giving us net exports. Right, calculating GDP. All we're doing are identifying our consumption, our investment, our government spending, and our net exports, and we're totaling them. So private final consumption expenditure is 15,348. Gross fixed capital formation 4,663 billion. General government spending is our G. Exports of goods and services X, and we need our imports M. Now the total nominal GDP using the expenditure approach is simply C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and we will get a total there of $29.548 trillion. Now an exam tip, the only thing difficult here, adding things up and subtracting imports is pretty easy. The GDP calculation is really easy. What might trip you up is being able to identify which is which component. And the most trickiest one is gross capital formation. Gross capital formation is investment spending. Remember that firms invest by purchasing capital goods, and that's how you will remember it. There are a few ways of measuring GDP which you must be aware of. We have got the output approach, the income approach, and as we've just looked at, the expenditure approach. The output method is something we don't really have to look at all. We're not too concerned about it. It's value added to the inputs of production, and these are summed. More importantly, the income approach, if you remember back to our circular flow model, we have incomes from the factors of production and we have expenditure on goods and services, and they were equal. So the income method, this method of determining GDP, is to add up all of the income earned by households and firms in each given year. So we take all of the income associated with each of the factors of production, wages, rent, interest and profit. We add them all up and out pops our GDP figure. Expenditure method, we've just looked at the total expenditures, investment, consumption, government and net exports. Add these all up and we determine a value for GDP. Quickly revisiting the circular flow model, we can see exactly where these two methods of calculating GDP come in. The income method, factors of production, payment for the factors of production, and the expenditure method, adding up all the domestic expenditures made on final goods and services in a single year. But it's not just household expenditure. We have the consumption from households, we've got investment from firms, we've got government spending, and we have got domestic spending on imports, and we've got the spending of foreigners on our exports. Add these all up and we have GDP. Right, so GDP, this is our formula here, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Households and firms, factors of production, goods and services, spending on those goods and services, income for the factors of production. We have our 3 withdrawals from the circular flow. The 3 additional sectors here, banking, government and the overseas sector, giving us international trade. Investment, government spending and exports are our injections into the circular flow. And we have our GDP calculations fitting in right here. So consumption spending is our expenditure on goods and services. Investment, right there. G for government spending. And net exports, X minus M, occurring down the bottom there. So this is where the expenditure method can be found within the circular flow model. We can calculate the different contributions to GDP. We take our formula. And with each different component of GDP, we can actually calculate its contribution to GDP. So take for example, we have got a total GDP for the US in 2016 as being $29,548,000,000,000, and if we try and calculate the percentage that government spending is contributing to GDP, it's dead easy. All we do is we take the GDP component, for example, the government spending, divide it by GDP itself and multiply by 100. So government spending, $3.990 trillion, divided by total GDP, $29.548 trillion, multiply that by 100 and we've got our percentage, 13.5%. So we can state that government expenditure accounted for 13.5% of US GDP in 2016. GDP per capita, a very important phenomenon.
But is sometimes expressed on a quarterly basis within a year. Real GDP is equal to the economic output adjusted for the effects of inflation. Nominal GDP is economic output without the inflation adjustment. Nominal GDP is usually higher than real GDP because inflation is typically a positive number. Nominal GDP is used when comparing different quarters of output within the same year. When comparing the GDP of 2 or more years, real GDP GDP is used because by removing the effects of inflation, the comparison of the different years focuses solely on volume. The year-to-year comparison for real GDP requires what is called a base year. The base year is nothing more than a year to which all the other years are adjusted. Think of it as the as-if year, in that all the other years' GDP must be adjusted as if prices were the same in that year as they were in the base year. For example, California million for 2013. $20 million seems like a substantial increase in GDP. But in 2012, the price of a golf ball was $1. In 2013, the price for a golf ball increased to $1.20. California's 2012 total output in units was 70 million golf balls. $70 million divided by $1. For 2013, the total output was 75 million golf balls. $90 million divided by $1.20. If the 2013 nominal GDP was adjusted for inflation so that the total units produced were calculated at the 2012 price of $1, since 2012 is the base year in this example, then real GDP for 2013 is $75 million. 75 million units times $1 per unit. With this adjustment, there is still an increase in GDP, but only $5 million, which is solely attributable to the increase in production from 70 million golf balls to 75 million golf balls.
Importantly, GDP per capita is a measure of average income per person in a country. So we take the total GDP figure and divide it by the population of a country. GDP per capita, a measure of the total output of a country that takes a gross domestic product and divides it by the number of people in the population. There's your formula. GDP per capita equals GDP divided by the population. GDP, the total value of goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. GDP per capita, we're dividing that total GDP amongst the population. Very similar to GDP is another measure of national income and national output, and this is gross national product.
Gross national product, GNP, is one of the many metrics economists use to measure a country's economic output. For any one year, GNP equals the market value of all the goods and services produced by the citizens of a country, whether those goods were produced inside the country or manufactured elsewhere. Although similar, gross national product is not the same as the more frequently used gross domestic product, GDP. The difference between the two is that gross domestic product is the total of all economic output within a country's borders without distinction between foreign or domestic ownership, while gross national product looks only at citizenship and ignores where the goods were produced. Because of this, GDP and GNP are typically close in number, but not exactly the same. In countries with many foreign investors, the GDP can be quite a bit higher than the GNP. While both GDP and GNP are important indicators of a nation's economic productivity, the U.S. Department of Commerce switched from using the GNP to the GDP as their primary measure of the United States' economic well-being. This makes it easier to compare the U.S. economy to other nations, as the GDP is used by the majority of countries throughout the world.
Let's have a look at this GNP in a little bit more detail. GNP, or GNI, gross national product or gross national income, accounts for income earned based on national ownership of the factors of production. So if a Kiwi owns a factory in Australia, the production of that factory, the value of the goods and services produced in that factory are going to be counted in the New Zealand GNP, GNI figures. So we're looking for something specifically like GDP, and we add net property income from abroad, which could be positive or it could be negative depending on the amount of foreign ownership. Okay, here we have General Motors, a US car company, and they have built a factory. Actually, they built quite a few factories actually in Brazil, and they start selling its cars to Brazilian consumers. Now the value of the output produced, incomes earned or money spent are used to calculate Brazil's GDP. Profits earned by the US firm General Motors from its operation in Brazil are added to the US GNP figure. Profits earned by the US firm from its operations in Brazil are subtracted from Brazil's GNP figure. And that makes sense, right? Because the profits that General Motors, a US company, are typically repatriated to America. So that's money leaving Brazil, making Brazil a little bit poorer, and entering the US, making the US a little bit richer. So in this case, America's GNP figure will be higher than its GDP figure, while Brazil's GDP figure will be lower than... No, sorry. Brazil's GDP figure will be higher than its GNP figure. Calculating GNP, GNI. If you can calculate GDP, there's no problem at all. The formula, GDP plus income from abroad minus income sent abroad. So that's what we term net income from abroad taken together. Here goes that formula. Just like we calculated GDP, this is the first thing that we do. Add up our C plus I plus G plus X minus M, give us our GDP figure, and then we simply find our net income sent from abroad. Income from abroad is added, income sent abroad is subtracted, and a final GNI figure, GDP plus net income from abroad, is 29.548 trillion US dollars.